This morning we continue in our Lent sermon series on building blocks of beliefs. Pastor Kelly and I, for some time now, have wanted to have an opportunity for us as a church to talk about what are some of those foundational beliefs of the church. Lent has traditionally been just such a season where new converts to the Christian faith and life would do a catechism, would do a study on the basic beliefs of the Christian faith, and then on Easter Sunday, they would be baptized. One of the tools that was used for that training was the Apostles' Creed. Most likely the Apostles' Creed came from about the 5th century, sometime during the 400s. And so we've been using that as our port of entry to talk about our faith. And today we continue by talking about how we believe in the forgiveness of sins. If it wasn't for forgiveness, I would not be a married man today. And I think anybody that's been coupled or partnered with someone understands how vital that whole notion is of forgiveness. In fact, I don't think any of my most meaningful and lasting relationships would exist today if it wasn't for our ability to say, I am sorry and I forgive you. You know, if we want our relationships to thrive, if we want them to be healthy, if we want those relationships to be life-giving, they require forgiveness. There is no way of getting around that. In fact, forgiveness is necessary in all of our relationships, whether it's with our parents or our children or our partners or whether it's with God. In fact, forgiveness is so central to our existence, our life. When Jesus was teaching us how to pray, what did he do? He said, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. The very first church I pastored, the way they said the Lord's Prayer is forgive me my sins as I forgive those who have sinned against me. And so this whole notion of forgiveness is essential. Now, the thing about the Christian faith and life is we do not focus on guilt, but rather we focus on mercy and grace. And so I think it's interesting that the way this enters into this is that I believe in forgiveness, the forgiveness of sins. So there's this whole notion that there's something that we need to be forgiven for. And the word that church uses is the word sin. Now, we've talked about that in worship before. The Greek word that's translated as sin means to miss the mark. The Hebrew word that's translated as sin means to stray off the path. And so there's this sense that somehow we've gotten off track or we've missed the mark, what we're shooting for. And this whole notion of sin captures that. Now, sins can be what we do or what we don't do. So our sin can be an act of commission by what we do or what we think or by what we say. But sins can also be acts of omission where we are not doing, where we haven't properly, our thoughts, our words, our deeds are not properly aligned. So what I'd like to do this morning is to give you a framework to think about sin, because I think if we have some different handles on it, that might be the way that we can then talk about how we are forgiven. So 3 different ways to think about sin. The first has to do from Matthew's Gospel that Pastor Kelly read from this morning. There's this whole notion of Emmanuel. In fact, when Joseph was engaged to Mary, she was found to be with child. What did Joseph decide he was going to do? He was going to break that engagement. He was going to quietly dismiss her. But yet an angel of the Lord came to Joseph, and Joseph was told about Emmanuel. Now, Emmanuel is a Hebrew word. It's only used once in the New Testament, and that's in the 2nd chapter of Matthew. It comes from 2 Hebrew words that are linked together. There's Emmanuel, which means with us, and El, which means God. And what it literally means is, with us is God. So one of the ways that we are called to live is we are called to live lives that are grounded in and centered in the presence of God. The God that is with us. And one of the ways we can sin is by not living in that presence. In fact, you think about Joseph. One, he was deemed to be righteous, to be in right relationship with God and others, because he practiced Emmanuel, God with us. Joseph's personal inclination, his moral structure, the societal practices were to break that engagement. And yet, what did he do? He honored Emmanuel, God's presence, God's call in his life, to stay in relationship with Mary and to love her and to build a life with her. So part of what Emmanuel is practicing the presence of God, is living our lives in such a way that we acknowledge that God is present in our life and God is with us, and what we're seeking to do is honor God in our lives. Now, Paul Tillich is a 20th century theologian and philosopher, one of those great thinkers, and he gives us another way of thinking about sin. In fact, Tillich always says we need to think about sin and not sins. By sin, he means that is our human condition. By sins, when we talk about sins, we're talking about acts. And he says that is a mistake. He says one of the things we need to understand about the Christian faith and life is that it's not about being good. It's about being loved. And if we understand that part of what the human condition is one that's marred by sin, and the way he talks about sin is alienation or separation. That we understand that part of what it means to be human is to be a person who has this condition of sin, who has this life that's been marked by sin, by this alienation, by this separation. And he says it manifests itself in three ways. The first is a separation between people. There's a separation between me and my neighbor. And he says we can see that in a variety of ways. One of the ways is, even people who we love, even our best friends, sometimes we will take a little bit of joy or a little bit of comfort when they experience misfortune. He talks about how we can see the atrocities that mark this world. I was coming to church this morning and I had my radio on. And it's the 25th anniversary in Rwanda. They're not celebrating. They're remembering that it was 25 years ago that there was the genocide there. Do you realize that about 800,000 people were murdered? About 1/10 of the Rwandan population was murdered during that tragedy. And just so we don't think that it has to do with others that are far away, we think about our own country. We think about the genocide of indigenous people in this country. We think about slavery. We acknowledge the brokenness of our own society. To this day, we can watch the news and we can see the tragic events that mark our local communities and our state and our nation. And we say how awful it is. And then we go and brush our teeth and climb into bed and roll over and fall asleep. So part of what Tillich wants us to understand is there's this separation between us and our neighbor. But he also says that deep down within our very selves, there's a separation between who we are and what we want to be. We tell ourselves that I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be truthful. And yet when our back is against the wall and it's more convenient, what do we do sometimes? Yeah, we lie. Pastor Kelly read for us this morning a passage where Peter says, "You know what, Lord, I would never abandon you. I would stand by you in all circumstances." And yet what does Jesus say? Before the cock crows 3 times, you will have denied me and you will have abandoned me. So there's this separation within the very self of who we are. It's almost as if there's an alien force that is causing us to do things that we don't want to do. And so there's this separation within ourselves. And then there's also this alienation or this separation from God, from the very ground of our being. We know that God has this claim on our lives, and yet we don't live in a way that honors that. So for Tillich, for Emmanuel, it's as if we're denying the very presence of God in our lives. For Tillich, it's that separation. St. Augustine talked about it as disordered lives. He said we are created in God's image, and we are a people that were created to love, and there's so many things that we love. Think about it. We love family, we love money, we love status. The list just goes on. And what Augustine says is sometimes we get those loves disordered. So, for example, if our love of friendship and our love of status come into conflict with one another. For example, a friend tells you something in confidence, and then you start gossiping about that. What has happened is your love of friendship is out of order with your love of status, of wanting to be popular, of wanting others to listen to you. We might both love money and truth. And yet, if we're willing to lie in order to earn money, we've gotten our loves wrong. How many of you have been following that whole admissions scandal, where parents have been lying and cheating in order to get their students into some highly selective universities? Think about how they've gotten their loves out of order. Here they want certain things for their children because they love them, and yet their loves are disordered because they're willing to lie and cheat in order to try to give their children those privileges. And so St. Augustine says that part of what happens in our lives is we get our loves disordered, out of order with one another. The good news of the Christian faith, like Tillich said, isn't that we're good. It's that we're loved. We worship a God who meets us where we are, offers us reconciliation and new life, forgives us of our sin, and sets us free for new life. Part of what we are called to do is to acknowledge the brokenness in our lives, to acknowledge those things that we have done, either through acts of commission or omission, that have hurt others. We are then called to literally to rethink that relationship, to rethink how we are engaging in the world. The church calls that repenting. It's literally to turn away from that which is separating us from God and our neighbor and from one another. And it's to once again orient our lives correctly, so we're back on path, we're back on track. We then commit ourselves to walking that path in ways that are no longer going to harm. And then, by grace through faith, we accept the good news that God loves us, that God has come to set us free for new life, and that we have been set free. Part of what it means to be a community of faith is to be a community that is able to acknowledge the brokenness of our lives, to talk with one another about our communal life and about our relationships, at times to say, I'm sorry, and to offer forgiveness, and then to move into the new life that God calls us to. In a few minutes, you're going to be invited to come up to the communion table. It's a table that's been set. It's a table where Jesus said that he offers the bread and this cup for new life and for the forgiveness of sins. My invitation to you is to come forward as a people who are loved and who are offered this incredible gift of reconciliation and new life through the forgiveness of sin. I would invite you to join your voice with mine in our prayer of confession that is up on the screen. Let us pray. Most merciful God,